and strangely silent, Gilbert Keith Chesterton once declared, on the subject of cheese. Now, you cannot argue with the veracity of that statement, right? But at the same time, you also have to admit it's kind of funny. And this, in many ways, sums up G.K. Chesterton. He was an English writer who sought after truth. He's been described as the apostle of common sense. He's been described as the knight of faith. He's also been called the prince of paradox because he was a lighthearted poet, a playwright, a novelist. He often did and said things to make people laugh. But he's more complex. For example, if that were all there was to say about him, we probably wouldn't be talking about him today. But for example, there are many people today who talk about him as an influence, and people not just today, but over the last 150 years, since he was born 150 years ago. So I'm going to give you some examples. C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, Ernest Hemingway, Neil Gaiman, Frederick Buechner, Philip Yancey, Brian McLaren, Franz Kafka, Ravi Zacharias, Philip Yancey, whoa, I already said him, George Orwell, Ingmar Bergman, Orson Welles, Terry Pratchett, Agatha Christie, and musicians like Nicole Insing, Larry Norman, Rich Mullins, Phil Keaggy, Terry Scott Taylor, and Andrew Peterson. Now, if you knew every single name on that list, you are impressive. The question put before us, though, is why? Why are all these people saying they've been influenced by Chesterton, and why should we read Chesterton today? He's born, as I said, 150 years ago. Well, if we think about that list of people who've claimed his influence over their work, that in and of itself could be enough reason to say we need to pay attention to what's going on with this guy. But there are other reasons. They're easier to justify, possibly. For example, one of his books, Orthodoxy, was included on Huffington Post's list of the 25 most important books written throughout the entire 2,000-year history of Christianity. 25. Or that in fact, the fact that in spite of the fact that his work, I do apologize about all these facts in there. I'm not quite sure what happened with that sentence, and I'm still not catching up with myself. In spite of the fact that all of his work is both enjoyed and found encouraging by all types of Christians, there's a group of people who are tirelessly working to get him canonized as a Catholic saint. At the same time, his fiction has provided the basis for a quite popular BBC TV series, The Father Brown Mysteries. And if those are not enough reasons for us to be thinking about Chesterton today, I will add that there are concepts in his writings that may help us think about who we are and our place in the world today and how we relate to it, as well as events from his life that may suggest ways for us to think about our own faith journeys or those of the people around us. By the way, I'm just going to do one little thing here. I am turning on a timer since we said we were going to try to do this in about 45 minutes. I really have not timed myself. So that will go off in about 45 minutes now. Notice how I waited 2 pages to do that. Chesterton wrote more than 80 books, 200 short stories, 4,000 articles or essays, 100 poems, and 5 plays. His prose works are divided primarily into 4 categories: fiction, including detective fiction, as well as fantastic adventures that sprinkle the everyday world with wonder; apologetics, books that explore important issues that were talked about during his lifetime. Oh wait, those are 2 different categories. So fiction, apologetics, books exploring important issues, and biographies. And before we talk about how great these writings are and why we should be reading them, one thing definitely needs to be acknowledged. While his writing was incredibly popular during his lifetime, many readers today find their first attempt at reading Chesterton quite difficult. There are multiple reasons for this, included but not limited to the following. 1, Chesterton deliberately slows his readers down. We expect writers today to help us through ideas as quickly as possible, but that was not his goal. He deliberately slowed his readers down. He asked his readers to go on a journey of ideas with him. And on that journey, he wants to help you see an issue from fresh perspectives, to enjoy the language that is being used to explore those fresh perspectives, and to really think about what he's talking about, instead of just repeating something that maybe you've already heard, or something that confirms the biases you already have. Some of his books, such as Orthodoxy or The Everlasting Man, slowly build one extended argument across the entire text. so that it takes the entire book to make one solid point. At the same time, however, Chesterton can be incredibly concise, summing up a huge concept in one pithy statement, such as this: the Bible tells us to love our neighbors and also to love our enemies, probably because they are generally the same people. Or, the Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting. It has been found difficult and left untried. We will look closer at some of Chesterton's writings in the hope that for those of us who've never read any Chesterton or have tried but given up, this will provide a door in that will help you be able to read. While for those who have been reading Chesterton for decades or who have taken the Urbana Theological Seminary Chesterton class, to provide you with more things to think about regarding his writings. But before we look at a few of these texts, there's two aspects of his life that I want us to think about, because I do think that they're things that are relevant to people today. At the time when At the time when Chesterton was writing, there was no internet, no television, and until later in his life, no radio. If you wanted to get news, the newspaper was it. That was the thing. And popular writers would go on tours giving lectures to huge audiences because, hey, that's where you're going to hear them and see them. No TV, no radio, shocking world. What did they do? During this era, over a time frame of almost 30 years, G.K. Chesterton would occasionally go on tour with a popular playwright named George Bernard Shaw, and they would hold public debates. Shaw was an atheist, a vegetarian, and a teetotaler. That is, he did not believe in drinking alcohol. Chesterton, on the other hand, was a Christian as well as an avid enjoyer of both meat and beer. Not only did these two tour together and debate their perspectives publicly, but they traveled together, stayed in the same places, ate their meals together, all while thoroughly enjoying each other's friendship. As their friendship developed, they encouraged each other's writing and work. For example, at one point, Chesterton wrote an entire book all about Shaw. Shaw's response, even though Chesterton disagreed with him on many points in that book, Shaw's response was, "It's the best work of literary art I have yet provoked." At the same time, Shaw believed so strongly that Chesterton would be an amazing playwright if he would just give it a try. For several years, he wrote amusing letters proposing all sorts of preposterous threats in order to provoke Chesterton into writing a play. These included things like threatening to run away with his wife. Sometimes two other friends would join their tours, the Catholic, Hilaire Belloc, and the atheist, H.G. Wells. And the fun continued with the larger crowd. In fact, at the Marion E. Wade Center in Wheaton, they have notebooks that have a lot of drawings that Chesterton would doodle in. And there's one that he did a doodle of him, the four of them together. It's Hilaire Belloc, G.K. Chesterton, H.G. Wells, and George Bernard Shaw in a cartoony style that clearly is a friend drawing a picture of a group of friends together. These people, in spite of their religious, political, and moral differences, were able to not only work and travel together, but they were close enough friends that they could thoroughly enjoy each other's company. The person mattered more than the ideas. This friendship, in spite of such differences, may well be a model we need today when dealing with friends or family members or even people we run into on Facebook who have differing political or theological views than we do. How do we engage the art of loving our neighbor when our neighbor holds views so diametrically opposed to our own? According to Chesterton, with good humor. The other aspect of Chesterton's life that may well be worth thinking about today is his journey to faith. It was complicated, it took a long time, and there were times at which if anybody had said that this guy Chesterton they know was going to be a well-respected Christian in the future, everybody who knew him would have thought it was a big joke. The story of his conversion actually begins with the story of his birth. As I said, he was born in 1874, 150 years ago. Happy birthday, Chesterton. His parents were at that time what was called progressive. His mother was a Unitarian, his father an atheist, and so on the very rare occasions when he and his brother did go to church, it was to a Unitarian church. His mother read extensively to her children, including books of fairy tales. Among the books classified as fairy tales in their house, they had a collection of Bible stories. His mother would read these, along with the others, on the grounds that these were fairy tales that were very important to shaping the culture that they were living in. Many years later, Chesterton explained that the whole mix of fairy stories together were actually part of his journey to faith, and we'll get back to that. This included, he points out in his autobiography, the fairy tales of the Scottish minister and novelist George MacDonald, especially The Princess and the Goblin and The Princess and Curdie. While he was a young man, he enrolled in art school. While there, he learned the skills that got him started after he graduated as an art critic, writing for a newspaper. Notice, not as an artist. And it also helped him develop his thinking skills. Just as importantly, however, or even more so, in art school, two things happened that we could say were a negative influence, or a negative thing working towards his ultimate conversion. The first was that he and his brother would play with a Ouija board out of boredom. And he had various friends who were interested in the supernatural. In his autobiography, which he wrote near the end of his life, so after his conversion, he describes this era as the era in which he met the devil, even though at the time he did not take any of it seriously. The second was that while at art school, the pervading philosophy among his peers was what he later described as a negative nihilistic philosophy. He began, he explains, to doubt whether anything even existed. My atheist friend told me so pompously that he did not believe there was any God, and there were moments when I did not believe there was any atheist. This ultimately led the young Chesterton to suicidal ideation. Now, he claims the situation changed when he developed a strange optimism. Because even if everything is just a dream, it's a good dream. At this stage, he began writing poetry that, while appearing lighthearted, was exploring these ideas about what is good, what is real, how do good things exist, and if anything exists, how did it get here? These pre-Christian poems were collected into a volume called The Wild Night. Allow me to read one of the lighter, more memorable ones from that time. It's called To the Babe Unborn. If trees were tall and grasses short, as in some crazy tale, if here and there a sea were blue beyond the breaking pale, if a fixed fire hung in the air to warm me one day through, if deep green hair grew on great hills, I know what I should do. In dark I lie, dreaming that there are great eyes cold or kind, and twisted streets and silent doors and living men behind. Let storm clouds come, better an hour, and leave to weep and fight than all the ages I have ruled the empires of the night. I think that if they gave me leave within that world to stand, I would be good through all the day I spent in fairyland. They should not hear a word from me of selfishness or scorn. If only I could find the door, if only I were born. Now, it's called To the Babe Unborn, but it's a poem that is actually about his struggle to find even what does all this world mean? Is this all real? What does it mean if it is real? So in this early poem, we do see something that is maintained throughout Chesterton's later work. This idea that the world as it is a glorious, wonderful place. The world we live in is amazing. In this poem, he appears to be looking for a way into that fantastic world that is everyday life. In later work, we see how he comes alive. After this book of poetry was published, Chesterton began writing art reviews for a newspaper. His circle of friends at the time, which included J.M. Barrie, the author of Peter Pan, came to know him as someone always willing to push things to the point of nonsense. He was always willing to engage in a joke. This was the time when he began carrying a sword stick, that is a cane with a sword hidden inside, strictly for dramatic effect. He also started wearing a large cloak and would cut a swashbuckling figure from a different fanciful era while walking down the streets of London. On the day he married, he did something his friends thought absolutely hysterical, even though today we would not find it funny. It's definitely a joke that was a joke at that time and not now. Before he and his wife took off for their honeymoon, he took a madcap ride in a hansom cab, that is, a cab pulled by a horse, to a shop where he bought 2 pistols, simply because, he explained, he was going to be able to defend his wife. At that time, in that place, that was simply not done, buying 2 pistols. except in the type of story, or for that purpose, except in the type of stories called romance. And that would be not what we think of as romance, but grand adventure stories with knights in shining armor. His friends all got the joke. This wild sense of humor complicates issues when, in 1903, something began that Chesterton scholars today call the Blatchford controversy. Richard Blatchford, a newspaper writer for the Clarion, wrote an article in which he claimed he completely disproved the worn-out superstition of Christianity. Chesterton wrote a response, which, to the initial amusement of his friends, defended Christianity. Wait, what? Chesterton? From his brother Cecil to other art critics, they all agreed that this was quite a good joke. But the controversy went on. Blatchford wrote a response to Chesterton. Chesterton published another article defending Christianity in response to that. This continued for 2 years. While his friends had to slowly admit that this debate was in earnest, it was only later that Chesterton explained, "I have grieved my well-wishers and many of the wise and prudent by my reckless course in becoming a Christian." Chesterton's career as a novelist began in the middle of this controversy with a book called The Napoleon of Notting Hill. It's a story about defending something small and special against something huge that would wipe it out, or at least remove everything about it that made it special. This futuristic novel was set in London in 1984 and engages both political and philosophical ideas. Ooh, 1984. And includes a curious plot device in which what one character does as a joke is perceived as deadly serious by another. Oh, does that sound familiar too? The interplay between the humorous and the deadly serious is part of what makes this book so fascinating. It's been cited as influencing both Michael Collins, one of the leaders of the IRA, the Irish Republican Party, or Army, in the first part of the 20th century, as well as George Orwell's books Animal Farm and 1984. For the next few years after the Blatchford controversy had ended, the essays were summarized in a book. Chesterton's friends, acquaintances, other writers, and critics kept asking him to explain himself. What did you mean by this? So finally, he agreed to write a book explaining what he believed. He actually wrote 2 books at this point. He wrote them at the same time. One was fiction, one nonfiction. They are 2 of his best-known works. The fiction was the novel The Man Who Was Thursday, subtitled A Nightmare, and the apologetic text was called Orthodoxy. While one is a genre-crossing thriller fantasy mystery, the other a nonfiction exploration of ideas all leading to one main point, in many ways, both books are about the same thing. And in fact, until the BBC started airing the Father Brown mystery series, which we'll come back to later, The Man Who Was Thursday was Chesterton's best-known piece of fiction. Some universities and colleges still use it as required reading in classes such as Intro to Literature or early 20th century lit. An article published in The New Yorker on the 100th anniversary of The Man Who Was Thursday described it as a funny and suggestively mystical Christian allegory that is also one of the hidden hinges of 20th century writing, the place where, before our eyes, the nonsense fantastical tradition of Lewis Carroll and Edward Lear pivots and becomes the nightmare fantastical tradition of Kafka and Borges. That was in 2008. A 2015 article published in the Atlantic Monthly describes it as an impish, ageless, inside-out thriller. In an article, like I said, published in the Atlantic, April 2015. So it's a book that people are still writing about in secular sources as well as Christian ones, trying to make sense out of it. On the surface, it's a story about a spy named Gabriel Sim who's hired by Scotland Yard to infiltrate a ring of anarchists. In this story, nothing, and I do mean nothing, is what it seems. In other words, in spite of the car chases, sword fights, and discussions of bombs and assassinations, The Man Who Was Thursday is not ultimately about anarchy or anarchists, or even spies. The key to the book is in the end, when the story breaks into a madcap, medieval-esque allegorical race in which Syme and others are trying to catch a man called Sunday in order to ask him to explain himself. Throughout the story, each anarchist is slowly revealed as a fake, who is really in search of authority and meaning and where those things can be found. Ultimately, it is discovered that there is only one anarchist, Gregory. Near the end of the story, a distraught Gregory finally is able to face Sunday and ask a question. But he does not ask what everyone else was going to ask, which is, explain yourself. Instead, he demands to know if Sunday has any awareness of the suffering he has put other people through, or if Sunday himself has ever suffered. I know, I'm totally giving the story away. But at least, if you sit down and read it, you know where it's going. Sunday's enigmatic response is, "Can you drink the cup I drink?" A question that should sound familiar to anyone who has read the Gospels. And think about that name, Sunday. While Sunday is not exactly God himself, this is a story about the search for meaning, for truth, and for God, as well as the questions that stop people from finding him. As earlier mentioned, it is not accidental that this book was written and published the same year as Orthodoxy. Orthodoxy has frequently landed on lists as well. Lists of the most influential books of the 20th century, as I mentioned, with Huffington Post's top 25, alongside of such well-known titles as The Confessions of St. Augustine and The Pilgrim's Progress. It's been described as a work of apologetics, a book of philosophy, and Chesterton's own spiritual autobiography. While the whole book is well worth reading, as it explains Chesterton's philosophical journey to faith, one chapter in particular has had a lasting effect, not only on writers such as J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, but it has been cited in discussions of literary theories about children's literature, fairy tales, and the modern fantasy genre. This chapter is called The Ethics of Elfland. In this chapter, Chesterton explains that the fairy tales he read, or had read to him as a child, set the stage for his adult conversion to Christianity. They did this by instilling in him a grounding for a moral code, as well as creating a space for the desire for the existence of God. It's a space for the desire for the existence of God, which is a different thing than believing in God. But for Chesterton, it was an important step on the journey. The good that fairy tales do works like this. First, fairy tales instill in their readers a sense of wonder. As he explains, these tales say that apples were golden only to refresh the forgotten moment when we found that they were green. They make rivers run with wine only to make us remember for one wild moment that they run with water. These stories lead us to see the world around us in a new light, to realize that everything that is might not have been. And this extends not only to the world around us, but to humans ourselves. It is no small thing that we walk around on two legs, or even that we exist at all. Throughout all fairy tales, there is a catch. There's always a catch. Chesterton explains it this way. In the fairy tale, an incomprehensible happiness rests on an incomprehensible condition. A box is opened and all evils fly out. A word is forgotten and cities perish. A lamp is lit and love flies away. A flower is plucked and human lives are forfeited. An apple is eaten and the hope of God is gone. Happiness in the land of fairy tales is dependent on continuing to not do something. The reason for not doing that one thing is completely irrelevant. It is often even arbitrary, because the issue is not one of understanding, but of obedience. This belief that the world is a wonderful place that was put into jeopardy by the breaking of a seemingly arbitrary rule should sound familiar to those of us who are people of faith. And it leads to Chesterton's next point. Stories of magic alone can express my sense that life is not only a pleasure, but a kind of eccentric privilege. Everything has been saved from a wreck. Every man has had one horrible adventure. As a hidden untimely birth he had not been, as infants that never see the light. Remember his earlier poem about the babe unborn? He is using the same metaphor here. Everything that is has been saved from a wreck. And yes, the fact that you exist means that you survived the most dangerous thing that happens to a human, that is, being born, especially at the time when this was written. Life is a privilege that not everyone gets. But the use of the word as here suggests that there is something else going on here. It's a symbol. The same metaphors of being born as coming to the light that the Gospels use to explain what it means to come to Christ. Life itself is a privilege, one we should never take for granted. For Chesterton, this made something else self-apparent. If there is a story, there must be a storyteller. He explains that he had a strong sense that since life is a gift, there must be a gift giver. There is someone behind all of this, someone we must say thank you to. So fairy tales taught the young Chesterton that the world does not explain itself. Magic must have a meaning. Therefore, there must be someone to mean it. That meaning must also be beautiful, even when there are dragons in it. The proper form of thanks, he felt, must be both humility and restraint. We do not say thank you for a gift by abusing that gift. The chapter also spends time talking about the kind of God Chesterton was finding must exist, a God who is both delighted and delightful. A God who says to the daisy, "Do it again." But he ends the essay by explaining that these stories, leading to these conclusions, set the groundwork for his faith long before he came to realize that Christianity was the fulfillment of these desires. The sense of wonder at the world as we meet it every day, the idea that the breaking of an arbitrary rule leads to all sadness and sorrow as we know it, that we who exist have somehow been saved from a wreck, and life in this wonderful world is a gift for which we need to say thank you. While these are ideas that, again, he points out this was part of his journey, he was not there yet when he came to these conclusions. But while these ideas are most clearly presented in orthodoxy, they are present throughout all of his writings. This includes his essays, even ones with names such as Running After One's Hat, in which he simply tells the story about chasing after his hat on a windy day in a crowded London street. And, his wife would not have been terribly happy if he had lost yet another hat. Or his apologetic book, The Everlasting Man, in which he gives his explanation that all of history points us to Christ. It is in The Everlasting Man that he gives a long-winded argument across 3 chapters that C.S. Lewis pithily summarizes in his famous Liar, Lunatic, Lord paragraph. Yes, in Mere Christianity. Yes, what C.S. Lewis does in 1 paragraph, Chesterton did in 3 chapters. It was The Everlasting Man about which Lewis said that a young atheist can never be too careful of what he reads, since this book helped him on his way to faith. But since we do not have time to discuss everything Chesterton wrote, or wait, do we? How many hours did you say? I mentioned he wrote more than 80 books, right? We'll focus on just a few more things. First, alongside of his friends Dorothy L. Sayers and Agatha Christie, Chesterton is considered one of the founders of the mystery genre as we know it today. These 3 were among the founders of a group of writers known as the Detection Club, mystery writers who all agreed to write their stories following a specific set of rules that included such things as the reader must be shown everything that the detective is shown at the same time, no introducing long-lost relatives at the end of a story as a solution to a problem. Fun fact, Chesterton breaks both of these rules in one of his stories. And from its founding until his death, Chesterton was the president of the club. According to Michael Bowen, in his book Benefit of Clergy, The Influence of G.K. Chesterton on Mystery Fiction, Chesterton's own ideas have become part of the furniture of the genre. For example, he came up with the idea of the stories that are solvable by the reader, where the reader is reading the story, discovering things the exact same time that the sleuth is discovering the same things. That was Chesterton's idea. That's opposed to Sherlock Holmes, who pops out at the end of stories with things like, oh yes, of course, this particular, I knew it was that person because he smokes that kind of cigar, and I know that that kind of cigar has the kind of ash that I found in this spot, which you don't know until he's explaining to you how he resolved the problem. Chesterton also invented a subgenre of mystery called the clerical detective, in which a priest, pastor, or some other professionally religious person, such as a rabbi or a nun, solves mysteries as a hobby. Now, I looked up just examples, and there were lists and lists and lists of them. So I thought maybe I'd just name a few TV series that I could find quickly by checking Amazon. Examples include Brother Cadfael, Father Murphy, Grantchester, Sister Boniface, and it suggested the series called Father Brown. Shocking. You get the idea. The list goes on. Chesterton founded this subgenre by creating his character Father Brown. The story of his creation, which may or may not be apocryphal, but it does end up in quite a few biographies, is a fun story. So, it goes like this. At one point, early in their marriage, Frances Chesterton, yes, that is Mrs. G.K. Chesterton, was worrying about the fact that a handful of coins was all the money they had. So, Chesterton reaches out, takes the money, and promises that he will not come back home until that money was joined by more. He takes that money to hire a hansom cab to ride to a pub that happened to be across the street from a publisher. And he drank until he ran out of money. It wasn't very much money. He then walked over to the publishers and asked what was selling best right now, or what would they buy off of him immediately if he just happened to have such a story on hand. They responded that mystery stories in the style of Sherlock Holmes were quite popular. He then requested paper and a pen and proceeded to write the first Father Brown story, The Blue Cross, which they promptly paid him for. Chesterton went on to write more than 50 more Father Brown stories, which were eventually collected into 6 individual books. Now, as I said, it may be an apocryphal story, but it's a good story either way. Father Brown is a crime-solving priest who, while he appears innocent, knows far, far too much about crime and the heart of the sinner because of all the listening he does in the confessional. This meek-mannered priest understands sin because he works with it every day. That gives him the unique ability to understand both hearts and motives. But Father Brown is unlike other detectives in that getting government-sanctioned justice is not his end goal. Instead, he wants to bring sinners to repentance. One example of how this works is in his stories is in The Queer Feet. Yes, The Queer Feet, in which Father Brown solves the mystery and confronts the criminal before the police arrive. This cornered criminal, realizing that Father Brown is cutting off his escape, declares, "I don't want to threaten you," meaning that Father Brown needs to let him go, or else. Father Brown calmly replies to this with the words, "But I do want to threaten you." They then have a conversation about sin and repentance, followed by the thief handing Father Brown the stolen items before the priest lets him leave. When Father Brown restores the items to their rightful owner, he explains that he has averted a crime and perhaps saved a soul. Father Brown understands sin, but he also sees each person not as a criminal, but as a wonderful creation of God in need of a right relationship with him. This is key to understanding Chesterton's approach to the mystery story. Along with his friends Dorothy L. Sayers and Agatha Christie's, he believed that the murder genre is inherently Christian. I'm going to say that again because that shocks a lot of people. Chesterton believed that the murder mystery genre is inherently Christian. Why? Because without a belief in sin, you have no mystery. A good mystery is a story that uncovers sin and causes the sinner to have to face what they have done. But in spite of this seriousness, many of his mysteries, like many of his essays and other fiction, are lighthearted. Certainly not all of them, but many are. For more than 10 years, the BBC has been airing a television series loosely based on the Father Brown stories. Out of curiosity, how many of you have seen an episode of Father Brown on BBC? They're fun, right? What is intriguing about these is that while many things have been changed, the heart of the story remains the same. Father Brown is concerned about the soul of the criminal as well as the heart of those injured by the crime, including those who have been falsely accused. They have the same lighthearted touch as many of the Father Brown stories, with the same belief in the seriousness of the crime itself. It's important to note that Chesterton's story is not his own story, is not complete without observing that while his first conversion to Christianity occurred sometime between 1901 and 1905, he does remain vague about that. At that point, he had become an active member of the Church of England, but later in his life, 1922, he converted to Catholicism, which he practiced until his death in 1936. This means that in 1910, when he invented Father Brown, the crime-solving Catholic priest, he was still going to be a Protestant for the next 12 years. Some have seen this as proof that he had always been on the journey to the Catholic Church. Others have seen it as evidence that Chesterton understood, like C.S. Lewis, that which form of Christianity you practice is less important than the core of the faith. As Lewis explains in Mere Christianity, it is the belief that God, in Christ, came and died for us, and somehow this makes us right with God, that is the heart of Christianity. Everything else is secondary. If one is looking for a place to start reading Chesterton, The Man Who Was Thursday, the Father Brown stories, or Orthodoxy are the most frequently recommended of his books. But there are many others worth reading, and depending on your own personality, you may want to try something else. For example, many love his novel The Flying Inn, in which alcohol has been outlawed in England. Shocking. Like in America during the Prohibition, so a couple of intrepid friends take a barrel of alcohol, a wheel of cheese, a cart, a pony, and a dog on a madcap adventure across the countryside, setting up an inn every so often to share their alcohol and cheese. This is not a financial venture. but a service to the people who need good cheer. It can also, of course, be read as a thinly disguised story about the proper role of the church. Now, whether the church does this or not is another issue. Yes, beer and cheese as a symbol of the church. Or for some, the story of his that stands out the most is Man Alive, the story of a man named Innocent Smith, a young man who, to keep life from becoming dull, continually does very odd things, like he re-woos his wife and elopes with her over and over and over again, while carrying a gun in his pocket to demonstrate to anyone who is fashionably nihilistic that maybe they really do believe life is worth living when there's a gun pointed at them. Or maybe The Ball and the Cross, which started as a series of stories published in a newspaper the same time as the Blatchford controversy, in which a Jacobite Catholic and a socialist atheist engage in a very real battle over their beliefs. Now remember, this is from actually before he would say later that he became a Christian, but he's exploring all of these ideas. He creates two characters who are extremes. Neither one of them is exactly what he would say you should, at the time when he wrote it at least, you should be lining yourself up with. And yet he's exploring ideas through these two characters. They're both presented as extremists, but they're both also presented as sympathetic. In the end, they discover that they have a common enemy. Their enemy is a world that says religion isn't really worth fighting over. A little bit ago, I read to you a poem that Chesterton wrote when he was young. I'd like to close this out by thinking a little bit more about a poem that he wrote after his conversion. I actually have two other poems that if you guys want, we can read and talk about. But I'm going to read this one to you, and I want to hear your thoughts on it, because I've heard three very, very different interpretations of this poem. I want to see what you hear. Remember, it is after his conversion. It's called The Great Minimum. It is something to have wept as we have wept. It is something to have done as we have done. It is something to have watched when all men slept and seen the stars which never see the sun. It is something to have smelt the mystic rose, although it breaks and leaves the thorny rods. It is something to have hungered once as those must hunger who have ate the bread of God. To have seen you in your unforgotten face, brave as a blast of trumpets for the fray, pure as white lilies in a watery space. It were something, though you went from us today. To have known the things that from the weak are furled, perilous ancient passions strange and high. It is something to be wiser than the world. It is something to be older than the sky. In a time of septic moths and cynic rusts, and fattened lives that of their sweetness tire, in a world of flying loves and fading lusts, it is something to be sure of a desire. Lo, blessed are our ears, for they have heard. Blessed are our eyes, for they have seen. Let the thunder break on man and beast and bird, and the lightning. It is something to have been. What do you think?
Can you read it one more time?
Sure, I'd love to read it one more time. It is something to have wept as we have wept. It is something to have done as we have done. It is something to have watched when all men slept, and seen the stars which never see the sun. It is something to have smelt the mystic rose, although it break and leave the thorny rods. It is something to have hungered once as those must hunger who have ate the bread of God. To have seen you in your unforgotten face, brave as a blast of trumpets for the fray, pure as white lilies in a watery space. It were something, though you went from us today. To have known the things that from the weak are furled, perilous ancient passions strange and high. It is something to be wiser than the world. It is something to be older than the sky. In a time of septic moths and cynic rusts, and fattened lives that of their sweetness tire, in a world of flying loves and fading lusts, it is something to be sure of a desire. Oh, blessed are our ears, for they have heard. Blessed are our eyes, for they have seen. Let the thunder break on man and beast and bird, and the lightning. It is something to have been.
Did somebody die?
That is one interpretation, that somebody died. And another interpretation is that it's a poem about Jesus. Do you want to explain why you think it's, what your thoughts are about, what's it saying about somebody who died?
Just they're missing these various things.
Okay, yeah. Why do you say it's about Jesus, whoever over there said it?
because there's so many things there that seem to be about Jesus.
To have wept as we have wept, to have watched when all men slept. Oh, does that sound familiar? Then in medieval literature, Jesus is sometimes referred to as a rose, or the rose of Sharon.
That reference to bread there also.
Those who have ate the bread of God.
The phrase that came to me was "it matters."
It matters.
It matters.
It matters. Life matters. So those are the three different interpretations that I've seen people come up with. You guys did an amazing job. One is that this is a poem that's so clearly he's lost somebody and it matters. And another one is this is so clearly a poem about the disciples and Jesus after Jesus has gone. And the other one is that it's about life. It's about life mattering. Everything that happens matters.
And the pursuit matters.
Yes. Thank you. That was good. Okay. Now, I can finish us off with a quote from G.K. Chesterton, or I'm sorry, a quote from Roland Hine, a scholar who writes about Chesterton, or we can do that with another poem. You want to do it with another poem? I'm getting one thumbs up. I'm getting a few people like, a nod over here. Okay, nobody's running out, so let's see. There's a funny one, and there's a more serious one. Do you want the funny one? Okay, this one's really funny if you know British geography. Just understand the general concept is that the places he's naming are nowhere near each other and definitely not on the way to each other, okay? That'll help. It's called the Rolling English Road. Before the Roman came to Rye or out to Severn strode, the rolling English drunkard made the rolling English road. A reeling road, a rolling road that rambles round the shire, and after him the parson ran, the sexton and the squire. A merry road, a mazy road, and such as we did tread, the night we went to Birmingham by way of Beachy Head. I knew no harm of Bonaparte, and plenty of the squire, and for to fight the Frenchmen I did not much desire. But I did bash their bayonets, because they came arrayed to straighten out the crooked road an English drunkard made. Where you and I went down the lane with ale mugs in our hands, the night we went to Glastonbury by way of Goodwin Sands. His sins they were forgiven him, or why do flowers run behind him, and the hedges all strengthened in the sun? The wild thing went from left to right, and knew not which was which, but the wild rose was above him when they found him in the ditch. God pardon us, nor harden us, we did not see so clear the night we went to Bannockburn by way of Brighton Pier. My friends, we will not go again, or ape an ancient rage, or stretch the folly of our youth to be the shame of age, but walk with clearer eyes and ears this path that wandereth, and see undrugged in evening light the decent inn of death. For there is good news yet to hear, and fine things to be seen, before we go to paradise by way of Kensal Green. It is such a tongue twister. It's part of what makes it funny is it's about something that's not serious, these roads that twist and turn and don't go straight, but it's also definitely a tongue twister. Very good.
As adult Dr. Seuss, if you ask me.
Ooh, Dr. Seuss for grown-ups. So you get a sense there of what Chesterton's poems are like. Part of why I'm reading them to you is I know that's usually the last thing people actually go for when they decide to start reading Chesterton. I do have one more, but we don't have to hear that one. Thoughts, observations? What? Okay, let's end with the quote. It is from Roland Hine. He wrote a book called Christian Mythmakers about 30 years ago now, in which he talks about Chesterton and Lewis and a bunch of other writers like this. But in his section on Chesterton, he says, to G.K. Chesterton, life was a mystery with a rightness at its heart. To see it accurately is to worship. He had a singular appreciation for the common things in life. The result of this attitude was the mythic vision, one that saw existence as a type of pleasant surprise. And there we go. So I can open it up to questions now. We have plenty of time for questions. Thank you for playing along with the whole poetry thing. I do have one more poem. Do you guys want me to?
Yes.
Nobody's voting against it. Okay. It's called A Child in the Snow. There is heard a hymn when the panes are dim, and never before or again when the nights are strong with the darkness long, and the dark is alive with rain. Never we know but in sleet and snow, the place where the great fires are, that in the midst of the earth is a raging mirth, and the heart of the earth is a star. And at night we win to the ancient inn, where the child in the frost is furled. We follow the feet where all souls meet, at the inn at the end of the world. Old gods lie dead where the leaves lie red, for the flame of the sun is flown. The gods lie cold where the leaves lie gold, and a child comes forth alone. Anybody have any ideas what that's actually about?
I need that again.
I'll read it a second time. There is heard a hymn when the panes are dim. Okay, when are the panes dim? At night, when it's cold out. Okay, there is heard a hymn when the panes are dim, and never before or again, when the nights are strong with the darkness long, and the dark is alive with rain. I'll give you guys a hint that nights are longer in the winter, and where Chesterton was living in London, you got rain just as often as snow during the winter. Okay, so it's winter, it's at night. Never we know but in sleet and snow, the place where the great fires are, that the midst of the earth is a raging mirth, and the heart of the earth is a star. And at night we win to the ancient inn where the child in the frost is furled. Any ideas what an ancient inn might be?
Where the child.
What is,
At night we win to the ancient inn where the child in the frost is furled. We follow the feet where all souls meet, at the inn at the end of the world. That would be? Why is it Christmas? It is Christmas, but why?
It's about a God and a child.
Yes, yes. And the inn is the inn at the end of the world. Why? See, you guys are good.
Bethlehem is nowhere, it's Hicksville.
That's one way of interpreting it, definitely.
I was thinking the end of our old ways when they come to Christ.
So you could have a literal.
Better answer.
You could have a literal interpretation. Bethlehem is Hicksville in the middle of nowhere. You could have a spiritual interpretation. It's the end of our old ways, the world that we used to know when we come to Bethlehem. I would say it's both. It implies both. The gods lie dead where the leaves lie red. Old gods lie dead where the leaves lie red, for the flame of the sun is flown. Old gods lie cold where the leaves lie gold, and a child comes forth alone. Anyway, thank you for humoring me. Thoughts?